Okay, so we're going to finish the history of forensic science and notes today, and that'll be it for notes this week. We'll do one last bit about how the law has developed next week, and then we'll be done with notes for this unit and be testing by the end of next week. So this is just kind of continue on the same time frame as we left off on Tuesday. And it's just basically to kind of show you our progression of how far we've come. So again, this is like the end of the 1800s. So we're in 2020 now. So 1920 would be 100 years ago. So this is about, around 150, a little less years ago. And how they were profiling murders. That's the psychology. So forensic psychology. This is a forensic psychologist at the time, Italian criminologist. And this was actually something that he put in his book on how to profile a murderer. And if you look through it, it is just pretty ridiculous. So basically he just put physical features. He didn't even put things that they would be like for the most part, other than a cynical attitude. That was the only part that was actually personality. The rest of it is about their appearance. So dark hair, bushy eyebrows, abundance of wrinkles, has a tattoo, dresses shabbily, like all those things could be true of a murderer, but could also not be. And obviously we know now that murderers can certainly look like anyone else. So this is a pretty terrible profile, and you're just going to kind of see on the next few slides how we're getting to like today's ranking of science and how it used to basically be just made up is kind of what it seems like. All right, we're going to move forward. So right after that, 1892, we've already been using fingerprints because if you remember the Will West story, they had to start using fingerprints because we realized that other types of measurements just aren't always going to work because sometimes our measurements are too close to each other. So we start using fingerprints, and these fingerprint classifications are actually still the same ones we use today. So the arch, the whorl, the loops, that'd be the most common. This kind of classification is still the one we use today, and we already knew about it in 1892, which is like 120 some years ago. Now, Carl Landsteiner is kind of the first scientist that I think of as a big science person of today. Like he's really pushing us into important things that we needed to know about in science today. He discovered the ABO blood groups. So the AB was found just shortly after, but he found the A, the B, and the O. Now, if you didn't know, before this, we really had no understanding of blood groups. We would give people blood transfusions with just anyone's blood and assume that it would be fine. Sometimes they would even give people blood transfusions with animals, which to us sounds crazy now, but to me, you have to put yourself back into the mindset of this time period where there is very little educated people, and if they were educated, it was like reading, writing, politics even, like that'd be kind of the direction. Science was definitely not what most people were studying, and it was just not understood at all that there can be microscopic things in our blood cells that make our blood react poorly with other people's blood. To believe in something that was invisible to the eye is something that just wasn't a normal thought at the time frame. So this was a huge discovery that led to us being able to do blood transfusions so much more effectively, so save lives. This was more of a greatness in medical research, but then now we can actually match it in crime scenes. So like someone leaves their blood behind, we can test it and find out it's type A, then that would narrow us down till we wouldn't look at suspects that weren't type A. So we definitely can narrow our pool of suspects. Then we get into 1910, just a little bit later. So this is Edmond Locard. Edmond Locard is the father of forensics, so that would make him important, the father of forensics. He had a workable crime lab, one of the first workable crime labs, and was also the director of the Institute of Criminalistics, so was helping train other people in forensic science in France. So he wasn't the person that brought it to America, but he is one of the forefront people that started crime labs and started training people to study forensic science. Now, something that he is very famous for is the phrase, every contact by a criminal leaves behind a trace. So basically, he was just trying to push the idea that there is evidence left there. If you haven't found it, then you haven't looked hard enough, or you haven't developed a test that can find it. But there is something to be found at every crime scene. You just have to know what you're looking for and know how to find it. I clicked out of it somehow. Let me go forward. So this is just a case that was a popular case for him. Sometimes I ask y'all to match cases that belong to different scientists. So for the father of forensics, Edmond Locard, he has Mary Littell. So Mary Littell was found strangled to death in her parents' home. A lot of times the suspects are their boyfriend or their spouse. You know, that'd be the first person they look at. She had a boyfriend called Emil Gorbin, but when they questioned him, he said he'd been playing cards with his friends, and his friends backed him up. They said he had an alibi, that he had been there the whole time, and could not have been the one that murdered her. But Edmond Locard goes and notices that if she's been strangled, then someone might have her skin under their fingernails or something like that. So he got a warrant for the fingernail scrapings of her boyfriend, and he went and he scraped them out and examined them, and basically what he found was they had a powder. Had a powder residue that he found under his nails that matched a type of lady's makeup. So when he went back to the crime scene to look at what makeup she owned and what was on her neck and face, it was the same powder. So he was a chemist by trade, and he matched them chemically. It was the same powder under the nails, and he was convicted. Now, how did the alibi get there? Because his friend said he was there. Was he actually had planned the murder, but then went to his card game ahead of time and turned the clock back. So like when they went to the game room, the clock was set backwards, so it made it look earlier than it was. So his friends thought that he had got there around 8 o'clock. So it's not like they had lied. They just had an incorrect time. Okay, clicking. So now we're still moving forward. So this was, I mean, he was 1900s. Now we're kind of like late 1900s. Well, not late, not 1970, but more like 1940s, 50s, 60s. Was Charles Norris and Alexander Geller. I guess really in the 20s, because they did Prohibition too. So, too far. So when Norris was like the head of the department, he's the one that went to court and tried to get people acquitted or try to get people convicted, whereas Alexander Geller was the scientist behind the scenes. So Norris did science too, but that's all Geller did. He didn't do the part inside court. He wasn't a lawyer. And Gettler was the one who revolutionized criminal investigation. A lot of techniques that he created on how to identify chemicals inside of a body, inside of a deceased body, are still being used today. Like, that's how good his work was. And the biggest part of how they kind of changed the tide of history is just that when they were brought on, most of the time, they, like, scientists' work for getting people convicted was not heavily used. People didn't really trust it. Cops didn't trust it. That was just not something that anyone really believed in. And they just kept proving their work, saying like case after case, catching criminal after criminal, until basically you couldn't not believe that it was a better way of trying to catch criminals. So just their popularity in New York turned the tide, made it to where it's like now we really don't want to do any crime cases that didn't involve forensic science. We'll learn more about them later in the year when we do toxicology. Oh, keep forgetting to do a disclaimer before the picture. So it is some like graphic images. This is of a body farm. So look away and just listen if you don't want to look at the images. So if you didn't know, there actually is body farms. There's actually one in Texas. I forget which college it's with, but I'm pretty sure it's a college down by Lubbock that they have a body farm for their interns and people who go to that college and are in forensic science to work on or to work in. Now, what their focus is anthropology, body decay, and telling time of death. It was created by Dr. Bill Bass, though, in 1970. So now we're getting pretty recent. So, this was 50 years ago is when body farms first became a thing. He was the one that started the very first one in Tennessee. And now that there are several more that have popped up throughout the United States, and they're even starting some in other countries now. Now, what it is people will donate their bodies to science, and then they will be left out in different ways. So some will be buried in a shallow grave, a deep grave, underwater, in a car, like just different scenarios. Now, why that would be important, because I know it's something that sounds kind of icky, but why it'd be important was before 1970, if we got to a crime scene and the person had been pretty decayed. So past a couple days. We really had no scientific research on how to tell time of death if it had been past a couple days. Like, all of the research we had would only work if the person had been deceased 2 days or less. So when we've reached any crime scene that has a body that is older than that, we had very little information on how to look at the person who is deceased and tell their time of death. And if you cannot tell time since death, you can't give me an accurate time of death, then we really can't check alibis. We can't look at like footage from cameras to see if the suspect was in the area. We can't check cell phones to see if they made calls. Like, all those things to have more evidence against a suspect you can't use if you don't know when the person died. So it's really, really important that we began researching how to figure that out. And Dr. Bill Bass was the first person to realize the need and start doing it, and hiring forensic anthropologists to come there and study the process of decomposition in different ways. Because it's going to be different. Like, if you just had never thought about that, if you were buried underground or left on top of the ground, the decomposition rates are going to be entirely different. So if you don't have a lot of research on every single type of scenario that could possibly ever exist, then when we get to that crime scene, we're not going to be prepared to be able to tell time of death. Clicking. So they let people go out there and train, medical examiners, other anthropologists, FBI, the cadaver dogs, so dogs that go and look for bodies that are buried. Like, there's a lot of opportunities there for people to train at these facilities as well. And then our last really important science guy for getting us into the now is Sir Alec Jeffreys. So in the mid-80s is when he began his work on DNA. So I know a lot of us today kind of just think that we can find DNA everywhere, and it was always a thing, but it really did not become possible until 1990 was the first year that we used it in a crime case. So that was 30 years ago. It was not long ago at all that we even began to use it. And when I say began, I mean began. So not like everywhere and all over the country is now using DNA. No, it's just that's when it became possible in 1990. So it didn't become a thing until 2000. So really very recent have we been able to use DNA. And this was the guy. So here he is, Sir Alec Jeffreys. This was the case that he discovered it. He'd been working on it, but for like medical reasons is why he'd been working on it in the past. But basically law enforcement was really struggling with this case. There was these two young women who had been killed time apart, but same way, same area. They had been assaulted and then murdered in the same area. So they assumed they had someone who was basically having a serial crime. So kind of like a serial killer, but he'd only killed two. So that's not really a serial killer yet, but they were thinking he'd probably do it again if he wasn't caught. And they had no leads. They couldn't figure out any way to figure out who did this. And they heard about Sir Alec Jeffreys, who had been matching DNA using semen samples, saliva samples, blood samples. Like, he was figuring this out. And they knew that they had those kind of things on the crime scene. And they said, do you think you'd be able to run a match if we found you our suspect? And at that point, no one had ever tried to use like crime scene samples. Like, they'd only use like fresh samples, like from a fresh cheek swab, things like that, or from a fresh blood sample. But he tested it. He figured out a way to use older samples, and they ended up what they did was they made every man turn in a sample in the area. Like, every single man had to come in and give a blood sample. And they didn't match anyone, and it took them forever. They tested 4,000 men's sample from 17 to 34 and found no match. And we're, thinking, oh my gosh, it's over. We'll never catch him. But then they heard basically a rumor. A man had been joking at a bar saying that he had been paid to take the sample for another man. Another man paid him to do his sample for him. They found out who that man was who paid. It was this man, Collins Pitchfork. They got a warrant. They tested him. He was the guy. So, but that was the very first case. It was at the end of 1980. So it was like 1989, I think, was when he was convicted. But so like it wasn't possible to be put on the market and used till 1990. So that was like gigantic. Now that we have DNA, like that is the coolest, most scientific thing we have ever done. And yet, to y'all, it probably sounds normal, but it definitely is a very new science, a very expensive science. So I guess I'll stop there for history.